Well, one of my favorite political movies released in 1993 starring Kevin Kline is this movie, Dave. And in the movie, President Bill Mitchell is having an affair with one of his secretaries, and during the act, he actually has a heart attack and slips into a coma and is unable to perform his presidential duties. Now, as opposed to subjecting the administration to embarrassment, the president's handlers decide to find a replacement who looks like President Bill Mitchell, a guy named Dave Kovich, who owns a small little temp agency and looks and sounds exactly like the president. In fact, he makes look-alike appearances on the weekend. Now, Dave is originally meant to be a silent and temporary stand-in for President Mitchell, but his coma lingers, so Dave has to perform more and more presidential duties, which he does with uncharacteristic verve and charm, at least when compared to the real President Mitchell. Dave also finds a lot of the responsibilities of being president a bit unsavory. So, from his new position of power, he begins to shake things up a bit. He reconnects with the American people. He gets rid of some shady characters. He actually brings in one of his accountant buddies to help rework the budget using some common sense, and actually makes room for a big homeless initiative and program, and the people love him for it. Now, the movie is a favorite because it's what so many of us Americans have always dreamed about. What if we could somehow sneak an outsider into the presidency? Someone who could shake things up, clean Washington out, return the presidency to the American people where it belongs. I mean, you know as well as I do that politics has become a bunch of insiders who care mostly about their own power. What if we could somehow throw the bums out and get an insider in there to clean things up a bit? Jesus knows exactly what we're thinking about, what we're yearning for. Thousands of years before the founding of the American Republic, Jesus came on the scene as the ultimate outsider. He came from outside the system to shake things up, to expose the corruption of the establishment. He came as an ordinary guy, one of us. He came as Dave Kovich, to stand up against the special interests that had rigged the system against it. Jesus stood up to them, he stood up for us, and the people loved him for it. That's what we're talking about here at Rooftop in our current series, which we just started last week. We started a new series called Jesus for President. I don't know if you've realized this, but it's election season here in the great U.S. of A. We're all in the middle of a very big decision about what we really want in a president and which of our candidates has those qualities and characteristics. As I explained last week, there are lots of qualities we want in our presidents. Leadership, vision, integrity, communication. Some of these candidates excel in these categories more than others do. Jesus of Nazareth, however, excels in them all. Jesus came as our quintessential candidate, our ideal leader. But Jesus isn't running for political office. He's running for a much more important position. He's running for the presidency of our hearts. He wants to sit in the Oval Office of our souls, from where he can use his prodigious leadership abilities to govern our lives all the way to heaven. So during this series, we're considering the qualifications we look for in presidential candidates and seeing how Jesus is far more qualified in every respect to be the leader that our world, our nation, our communities, our churches, and especially ourselves really needs. Now, last week, we looked at the criteria of leadership, something that we look for in presidential candidates, and how Jesus is the sort of leader we need. He can take us from here to there. This morning, I want to talk about something else we look for when considering presidential candidates, and how Jesus excels in this category too. We look for someone who is an outsider. We look for candidates who come from outside the system. We look for people who have never held political office before, who are not corrupted by politics. We look for men and women with fresh ideas who can challenge the status quo. Maybe you've realized this, but in the past few election seasons, our population has become obsessed with political outsiders. Donald Trump is the consummate outsider. Never held political office before. He's a business owner. He's a reality TV star. He's a provocateur. Millions of people around the country like the way that he might shake up the system, but it's not restricted to Donald Trump. The Republican field has become awash in potential outside candidates. Ben Carson was a brain surgeon. Carly Fiorina was a business executive. Steve Forbes from a couple elections ago, I don't know if you're old enough to remember that, he was another business executive. Herman Cain was a pizza expert. Even the Democrats have featured some outsiders, although not as many. Wesley Clark was a retired military general. And Bernie Sanders has been a longtime senator, but during his run for the presidency, he ran solidly as an outsider, decrying the influence of big business on big government. We like outsiders. Politicians know this, which is why they do their best to portray themselves as outsiders, even if they're not outsiders. And they've done this since the beginning of America. Andrew Jackson served in both houses of Congress. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember Andrew Jackson, but Andrew Jackson, he served in both houses of Congress for a long time, but in 1828 ran for the presidency against incumbent John Quincy Adams by portraying himself not as the skilled politician that he was. He portrayed himself as the frontier candidate, as a frontiersman. He won in a landslide. Abraham Lincoln had been in politics for over 10 years, but when he ran for president, he didn't run as someone familiar with the halls of power, someone who could get things done in Washington. He ran as the rail splitter candidate, emphasizing his working class roots. Same thing with Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter, James Garfield. They all ran as outsiders, even though they weren't. Every politician worth their salt finds a way to run as an outsider. They know this is what the American voters want. They want something different. They want fresh ideas. They want hopey, changey stuff. They want someone to shake up the system a little bit. Which brings us back to Jesus. Jesus came as an outsider. When he appeared on the scene 2,000 years ago, he came as the ultimate anti-establishment figure. How do I mean? Well, it's really hard to define exactly what we're talking about when we talk about outsider candidates, but they do feature a few distinguishing marks, all of which Jesus meets. When I think of outsider political candidates, I think of candidates who demonstrate four qualities. For example, outsider candidates come from outside the system. Outsider candidates bring fresh perspective. Outsider candidates fight for the little guy. And outsider candidates campaign against the system. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about outsider candidates. And by those measurements, Jesus is the ideal outsider candidate. Let's take a look at them one by one. For starters, an outsider is someone who comes from outside the system. In the first century, the nation of Israel, Jesus' nation, was under the leadership of very entrenched political and religious groups. The family of King Herod oversaw the political life of the nation. The Jewish council, known as the Sanhedrin, oversaw the religious life of the nation. Neither of these groups liked or wanted change. They worked very hard to maintain the status quo, protect their own interest. All their leaders looked and acted a certain way, kept outsiders out. Jesus was definitely not a part of this operation. He was not a politician. He was not an army general. He had no connections. He was, in fact, a poor, miracle-working preacher from Galilee. The system derisively referred to him as the son of that carpenter, Joseph. People liked this about him, though. They liked that he came outside the system. His rallies attracted huge crowds. People followed him into the countryside to hear him speak. After he spoke, he was commended as one who spoke with authority, not like the teachers of the law, not like those insiders. Jesus was an outsider. He came from outside the system. What else makes an outsider? An outsider brings a fresh perspective. Jesus did this too. For generations, the people of Israel had been hearing the same thing from their leaders. then when it came to pleasing God, they had to obey every jot and tittle of the law. That's what their religious leaders had been telling them, that in order, if they had any shot with God, they had to live perfectly religious, righteous lives. Jesus came reminding the nation of Israel that God is not just a God of law, but a God of grace and love, and a friendly God even. He said, yeah, there's a lot of rules you got to obey, but really they all boil down to really two. There's two laws you got to obey. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's really the only two things you got to pay attention to. Everything else just kind of hinges on those things. This was a very refreshing perspective for people back then. Jesus was an outsider. He brought a fresh perspective. What else defines an outsider? An outsider fights for the little guy. Outsiders remind the establishment that their job is to represent the people, the little guy, but the establishment seems to forget this. The establishment forgets about the people they were meant to serve. This had happened in first century Israel. The religious leaders had enacted laws which oppressed instead of served the most helpless, weakest members of society: women, children, Gentiles, the sick and diseased, the disenfranchised. The establishment had forgotten about these people, even making life harder for them. In Luke chapter 14, for example, Jesus is at a political function at the home of a Pharisee. The Pharisees were one of the leading political religious establishment groups of the day. At this function was a man sick with dropsy. Now, it was against the rules to do any healing on Saturday, any healing on the Sabbath. You're familiar with that Old Testament regulation. It was against the rules to heal people. It's one of the kind of weird requirements that they had back then. Jesus didn't care about stuff like that, though. He healed the guy, sent him on his way. He got into trouble for it, but these are the people he came to serve: the little guy, the sick, the ignored. As he makes clear in his platform speech from Luke chapter 4, he said this: I have come to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight to the blind, to release the oppressed. Jesus came to fight for the little guy. He was an outsider. And what else distinguishes an outsider? An outsider campaigns against the establishment. Outsiders fight hard against the system to bring reform and renewal. Jesus did battle with the establishment. He knew that the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the Sadducees had become corrupt. He came to replace and expose them. He marched into their temple and overturned their tables, saying, "How dare you turn my Father's house into a den of thieves?" He announced their imminent destruction. He told them that the day of reckoning was coming. He pounded on the podium at the convention in Matthew 23, and he said, "You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell?" He railed against the establishment. Of course, this was too much for the establishment to bear. The Pharisees didn't really like it, nor the Sanhedrin. Jesus was making too much of a scene. He was threatening their hold on power, so they came up with a plan to do him in. It's kind of like that old Frank Capra movie, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Remember that movie? You old enough to remember Mr. Smith Goes to Washington? Okay, that predates you. Anybody else old enough to remember Mr. Smith Goes to Washington? It's an old Frank Capra movie. Frank Capra was this director who puts together these movies. Everything ends up happy in the end. It's a Wonderful Life, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. But in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Jimmy Stewart, the ultimate political outsider, he gets accidentally appointed to the Senate. Nobody thinks he's going to amount to much in the Senate, but he starts making waves, starts making a difference, starts exposing corruption. The power brokers can't stand this, so they concoct a plan to take him down. It almost works, but Frank Capra makes sure it doesn't. In the case of Jesus, though, there is no Frank Capra to save him from the plot of the establishment. The Sanhedrin trumps up charges of political sedition, has him executed by the Romans. They execute this outsider to protect their insider status. Of course, and as you know, this was all part of the plan. Jesus knew that his story was going to lead this direction, but not end there. His death was a sacrifice that satisfied the holiness of God, allowing people to be forgiven of their sins. He rose from the dead, defeating the power of death. And in a terrific irony, God gave this crucified outsider the ultimate insider status. God elevated this crucified outsider to the ultimate insider position, exalting him to the throne of heaven, from whence he can judge and govern the entire universe. The ultimate outsider became the ultimate insider. So if that's what it means to be an outsider, though, someone who comes from outside the system, fights for the little guy, brings a fresh perspective, campaigns against the establishment, Jesus fits the bill. What does that mean for us, though? So what? What does it mean for us that Jesus came as the ultimate outsider who was exalted to the ultimate insider position? One of the reasons why so many people are disenfranchised with the political system these days is because the exaltation of our leaders doesn't really mean anything for us. We vote for these people who become presidents or senators, and then they sort of forget we exist. So why should we really care? Similarly here, why should we really care that God exalted the ultimate outsider to the ultimate insider position? Well, hopefully you understand this, but for you and I, the exaltation of Jesus to the ultimate insider position in heaven means everything for us. It means that we are now God's insiders. Jesus came as an outsider to the system, but was raised to life and placed on the throne as God's insider. In doing so, God has raised us to insider status with Christ. We too have been raised with Christ. We were excluded from God in the kingdom of heaven by our own sin, but Jesus died on the cross so we could be forgiven. He tore the veil in the temple so that any man, woman, or child can approach the Father in the Holy of Holies because of what Christ has done. We are now insiders, as Paul wrote to the Corinthians, or the Ephesians rather. At that time, you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope, without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were far away have been brought near through the blood of Christ. So we were far away, but through the blood of Christ we have been brought near. We were outsiders, now we're insiders. The blood of Christ has made us insiders. You know what this means? It means that we get all the privileges of heaven. We get all the privileges of being an insider in the kingdom of God. Have you ever been an insider anywhere? Have you ever known the privilege of being an insider? When I go to ESPN.com to check the sports articles there. Anybody else go to ESPN.com? I love reading the articles there, but there's always a bunch of material that I can't access because I'm not an ESPN insider. If you pay like $6 a month, you get special access to ESPN insider material. You get special sports reports. You get advanced notice on trades and stuff like that and contract negotiations. So every time I go to ESPN, I like the articles, but I never feel like I'm really on the inside because I'm too cheap to pay the fee. I don't really ever feel like I'm an insider anywhere, certainly not on ESPN.com. A few years ago, though, I did get a brief glimpse of what it's like to be an insider somewhere. A few years ago, I know a guy, I still know him, a guy who used to work down at Busch Stadium. You might know him, too. His name is Rob. He's right up there at the camera booth. Everybody say hi to Rob. Look, it's like kind of like Busch Stadium, waving to the cameraman. Rob used to work in the production booth down at Busch Stadium. And he invited me and the fam down after a game for a tour of the stadium. And by tour of the stadium, I don't mean like a tour of the bleachers. Like that's A, and that's B, and that's C. No, not a tour of the bleachers. I mean a tour of the stadium, like the inside part of the stadium, like where the offices and the important people go. He told Michelle and I to take the kids after the game and go to this special elevator that normal people can't use, and press this special button in the special elevator that normal people can't press, and then get off the elevator and walk up to a special door, and there will be a lady sitting there with a red Cardinals jacket on, guarding the door. She will be sitting there on a stool. She might scowl at you, Rob said. She might raise her finger and say, "You shall not pass." But don't worry about it, Rob said. I'll meet you there. So after the game, we got in the special elevator that normal people can't get on, and we pressed the special button that normal people can't press, and we went out the doors, and we went up to the doors with a lady who, sure enough, had the red jacket sitting on the stool with the scowl, and she started to raise her finger. She started to say, "You shall not." But then Rob Glessner popped out of nowhere and said, "Don't worry about it, Edna. They're with me." And he gave us special badges. And then Rob Glessner showed us around the joint. He showed us the video production booth. He showed us the station where the guy puts together the thing with the hats and the ball that's kind of moving around, and you got to guess where that is. And then he took us to the little room where the organist gets to play. He gets to play all those special Busch Stadium songs. You know that song? That song. I got to see where they play that. We got to see Mike Shannon in the special KMOX booth. He actually acknowledged us. Hey, he did that. We got to see special Busch Stadium offices. We walked around the place like we owned it, like we belonged there, and we did because we were with Rob Glessner. Rob Glessner had made us insiders. Same thing with Jesus, but much, much cooler. Jesus died to make us insiders to heaven. We have access to the offices. We have access to the organ. Wouldn't it be so cool if we get to heaven and that song is playing? We have access to the throne room of heaven. We have access to the Father. When we die, we'll show up at the gates of heaven where there might be an old lady sitting there at the gate on the stool with the red jacket. She might raise her finger and say, "You shall not pass." And Jesus will pop out of nowhere and say, "It's okay, Edna. They're with me." We'll go right in. We're insiders. That's what it means that Jesus has become the ultimate insider. He's made us insiders. No matter how rejected we've been, how unqualified we are, how sinful we feel, how irreligious we are, or what we did last night. If you believe in Jesus, you're an insider. You've got the run of heaven. You've got the Father's ear. You've got the hope of eternity. That's what it means that Jesus came as an outsider who then became promoted to an insider. He kicked all the other insiders out and made us insiders. But that does come with a couple expectations that I want to share with you real briefly before we leave this morning. Being insiders in the kingdom of heaven does come with a couple responsibilities, a couple expectations that we should understand. First, as insiders, we must resist the corruption that can happen to insiders. As insiders, we must resist the corruption that can happen to insiders. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. Insiders become corrupt all the time. I mean, how many stories have we heard about men or women who go to Washington pledging to clean up the government, but then get corrupted in the process? They get corrupted by money and power and sex. They didn't mean to get corrupted. They didn't even know it was happening, but it did. Maybe you've heard the case of Jeff Smith, ironically named after the character in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Jeff Smith was an idealistic, up-and-coming St. Louis politician who years ago pledged to fight for the little guy. It kind of makes sense because Jeff Smith's actually a rather short guy. But Smith got corrupted by the game. He actually went to jail for a few years because of his crimes. Insiders get corrupted all the time. And this happens in church. It happens to us. Jesus died for all of us outsiders, making us insiders, but then we become the corrupt insiders. We become the Pharisees. We become the Sanhedrin. How do I mean? I mean, we try to hold on to our status as insiders by keeping the outsiders out. We start rigging the system for our own benefit. I mean, we've all been to churches where this has happened. The church becomes filled with insiders who think they own the place. The thing we have to remember is that this can happen to us too. It can happen so subtly, we might not even notice it. It might already be happening here at Rooftop. I mean, we're 15, 16 years old. Some of us have been around here a long time. We might have started to regard ourselves as insiders, corrupt insiders. It happens when we start taking ourselves too seriously. It happens when we start thinking we've been at this church so long that we deserve special treatment. It happens when we start thinking that we've deserved and earned our place in the kingdom because we're so holy and righteous. It happens when you start judging other people for not behaving the way we think they should. And we cannot let that happen. It's why I like what Paul says in Ephesians, one of the verses I shared with you. He says, "Remember that at that time you were separate from Christ. But now, in Christ Jesus, you who once were far away have been brought near through the blood of Christ." We have to remember that. Remember that it was Christ's blood who made us insiders. It's not anything we did. It's not anything we deserve. We didn't pay that ESPN monthly fee. Jesus paid that fee for us. We're insiders because he paid that bill. We got to remember that. That's the first thing we got to remember as insiders. But there's another thing we got to remember too. It's that as insiders, we must welcome and serve the outsider. As insiders, we got to welcome and serve the outsider. This is why Jesus came, to serve and bless those who have been excluded from the kingdom, the sick, the disenfranchised, the ignored. They had been left out of the kingdom, a kingdom which had been built for them. So Jesus came and brought them in. He even came as an outsider so that outsiders would trust him. He came as a homeless man so that the homeless people would believe him. He came as a persecuted man so that the persecuted people would trust him. He came as an impoverished man so that the poor people would believe him. This is our calling too. It's to use our insider status to welcome and bless the outcasts. As Paul writes in Colossians, be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Who are the outsiders in our day and age? Anybody who doesn't think they're good enough, or that they don't fit into our church or into the kingdom of God. The poor, the sinners, the immigrants, gay people, awkward people, mentally ill people, single people, old people, anybody, people who don't share your politics. Anybody can be an outsider to you. That's who Jesus came to save, who we exist to serve. And the best way to do this is to live like an outsider. The best way to reach outsiders is to live like an outsider. As Paul says to the Corinthians, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became a Jew so that I can win the Jews. To the Gentiles, I became a Gentile so I could win some Gentiles. To the weak, I've become weak so that I can win the weak. I've become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. That's the best way to reach outsiders, to live like outsiders. Now, that does not mean we should become prostitutes, to reach out to prostitutes, just to be clear. Doesn't mean that we should develop drug addictions, to connect with drug addicts. It just means we should get to know normal people in meaningful ways on their turf. It means hanging out where normal people hang out. It means identifying them. It means going to school where they go to school. It's one of the reasons I'm such a big believer in public schools, because that's where religious outsiders go to school. I know that there are non-Christian people at Christian schools too. Don't email me this week. We all have our passions and beliefs. Spend your time, instead of emailing me, doing something more productive for your environment. But I'm preaching, I get to say what I think. It's one of the reasons why I don't dress up like a stuck-up pastor on Sunday morning, because normal people don't wear suits to church. I mean, I don't always dress up like an American flag, but it's why I try not to sound and talk like a Christian when I'm talking to normal people, because normal people don't understand why Christians talk so weird. Normal people turn on Joy FM. I know we've got to be sensitive because I have some Joy FM employees here, but normal people turn on Joy FM and they think they're speaking Cantonese. It's why we send people downtown to on Monday nights, because that's where homeless people live, downtown. It's why we do the food pantry on Thursday nights, because we want normal, hungry people to know that God cares about their hunger. It's why we sent a whole bunch of people over to Greece a couple months ago to serve the refugees, because that's where the refugees are. If you want to connect to refugees, thank you, Tom Petty, you got to live like a refugee. If we want to reach outsiders, we got to live like outsiders. That's how God came to reach us. Jesus came as an outsider to let us know that he understands what it's like to live on the outside. He was killed. He was crucified by the powers that be, but he was raised by the Father to the ultimate insider position. From his position, he gives us our insider badges. He invites us past the mean lady by the doors with the red coat and the scowl. He gives us the run of heaven. That's true for me. I'm an insider. And I hope it's true for you too. Maybe it's not, though. Maybe by your own admission, you're an outsider to the kingdom. Maybe you feel too different to live on the inside, too irreligious, too young, too old, too complicated, too troubled. But you're not. Jesus can get anybody into heaven. Jesus can get anybody past the old lady with the scowl. You just tell her, I'm with him. I'm with that guy. Hillary Clinton, has a slogan these days that you might have heard. It goes, "I'm with her." I kind of like it, actually. It's kind of catchy and empowering. But Hillary Clinton, she knows this, but Hillary Clinton, I hope she knows this, she cannot get us into heaven. Only Jesus can do that. Only Jesus can get us past the gate. Maybe you've never told God you want inside before. Maybe you've never told him you want to be an insider, you want to be his child, you want all the privileges of heaven. You can tell him that this morning. It's simple what you tell him. You just tell him, "God, I'm with him. I'm with Jesus." He'll get you inside. He'll get you past the gate as long as you remember. The rest of the world's outsiders who want and need to get in too. As long as you remember that it's nothing that you did to get inside that gate. It's nothing that you did to get inside the special offices of Busch Stadium. It's Jesus' act on the cross. It's Jesus' blood that got us on the inside. As long as you remember that. Let's pray.